And what are the different types of nuptial agreements?
Well, effectively you get an antenuptial agreement, which is an agreement that's signed prior to becoming married.
Okay.
Most people refer to it as an ANC.
Yep.
And then you get a postnuptial agreement, which is a method of varying your marital property regime after you've gotten married.
Which one is less admin?
Effectively, you're much better off signing an agreement like this prior to getting married.
Okay.
Once you are married, a change in your marital property regime entails a substantive application to court, to the High Court. It entails advertising the fact that you are going to change your marital property regime for the purposes of debtors and creditors, so that any parties that might stand to be prejudiced by the fact that you are now separating your estates are forewarned. And it can be quite an expensive and laborious affair.
Is there a fee associated with signing after you're actually married?
There's normally a fee associated with both.
Okay.
When you deal with an antenuptial contract, you will probably consult an attorney, and the attorney will charge you a rate for their time, and you will have to have the agreement notarially executed, and there might be a charge involved with that as well. But the charge is very, very small in comparison with going through the process of varying your marital property regime after marriage. So entering into a postnuptial agreement will have a much, much more onerous cost consequence. You'll end up paying an attorney to consult to draw a substantive application where you'll have to draw affidavits under oath explaining to the court why you are changing your marital property regime, and then, as I said, go through the process of advertising and dealing with all of the let's call it red tape issues surrounding the application. And then finally you'd have to appear in court and, if necessary, deliver some evidence. But if your evidence on affidavit was accepted, then you wouldn't have to do that. But effectively there would be a much, much higher cost involved in varying your marital property regime.
Okay, and what happens if you don't sign anything and the marriage and you decide to get a divorce?
Well, I think let's go back a step. What happens if you don't enter into an antenuptial contract and you're married in community of property? During the course of your marriage means that your estates are lumped together. Okay. And even if one of you buys an asset in your own name, for the purposes of your creditors and the outside world, effectively the assets are owned by each of you in equal shares.
So in layman's terms, I am getting married to someone else and they buy the house. So just because we haven't signed anything, that house is now in both of our names.
That's correct.
Okay.
Which means that if you incur any debt that you can't service and you can't pay, your creditors would be able to claim execution against your assets, and your husband's home would automatically form part of your assets.
Okay.
So your creditors would be able to attack his property because of the fact that you haven't separated your assets.
Okay.
So that I think is the major consequence during marriage, is that you don't have an effective tool to protect certain assets under certain circumstances. And I think you mentioned stigma before. I don't think it should be seen as stigmatic, but effectively, if one of you is involved in private business, in business that might be risky in terms of debt and in terms of the risks attached to the business itself, then it means that both of your assets would be open to attack, and you could lose assets like your family home and any other valuable assets that you might have in the process of those risks coming to fruition. If you decide if you decide to sign an antenuptial contract, you can plan. If one of you is gainfully employed and salaried and one of you is engaged in private business, you might decide to put certain assets in the other spouse's name, and that creates some protection for you. There are certain instances in insolvency where those assets might come under attack, but it is much more difficult for a creditor to attack the assets of a spouse who's married to you out of community of property.
So this is if you have your own private business and you're married to someone?
Generally speaking, your own private business, or you're engaged in certain activities that might be risky from a credit perspective.
Okay.
And again, I don't think it should be viewed as a way to avoid your creditors or to defraud them, but it certainly is a prudent way to plan if one of you is involved in a business that might or might not succeed, and it might have severe financial repercussions.
So it's a way to kind of protect assets for the both of you.
That's correct.
And protect yourself should a business
and your family.
Yes.
Especially if you have kids, it's quite wise to make sure that certain of your assets are protected as far as possible. On dissolution, as I mentioned before, it's kind of my opinion that the invocation of the terms of an antenuptial contract is a side issue. It's a natural consequence of a divorce. And in the circumstances of divorce where you have not signed an antenuptial contract, the traditional approach is to effectively lump the estates together, determine the value, and divide that in half. So each party would walk away with a half share of the assets in their estate. If you've signed an antenuptial contract, effectively each party retains what is his or hers. Those are the theoretical models, and as we know that we don't always follow the theory, and most divorces are negotiated. But at the end of the day, that's the basic situation, except where you have accrual, which means that for the period of the marriage, the parties' estates are effectively lumped together as if they were in community of property.